Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos, and if you go into the woods today, you're in for a big surprise. In the old days, that's because you would have discovered the teddy bear's picnic. But unfortunately, today it's probably because there's too much dogging. Well, going into the woods is what we're going to be talking about today because we're going to be looking again at Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods, and in particular the production from 2010, which was performed at the Regents Park Open Air Theatre. And the reason I'm talking about that is because it's a show that you can see again. As you know, in this terrible time of the COVID pandemic and significant restrictions on our lives and also on the closure of theatres, one of the few pleasures has been the rise of virtual theatre, where recordings of shows have been made available to people to watch in their living room. It's not the same as going to the theatre, of course it can never be, but in the absence of that, it is about the next best thing. And to my delight, the place that I always go to first for musical theatre, virtually, is a site called Broadway HD. I've mentioned it several times here before on Musical Talk, and I'm sure I'll mention it again. And if you go on there, and certainly if you're a British customer, you'll be able to find a version of that 2010 Into the Woods by Stephen Sondheim. It was a majestic production, very well received at the time, and partly reimagined the show in a slightly different way, which has now become normal, having added that original idea, which never quite made it to the stage in the 80s and 90s, of having a third generation involved in the story, by starting off with a little boy running away into the woods and having to be found by his father. Now, I can't guarantee that this show is streaming in all countries because Broadway HD has different licenses, which means that different shows are available in different territories. But if you're British, it's certainly available, and I would hope that it's also available to overseas viewers. So do go and have a look at the website. For me, it was a wonderful opportunity to revisit a wonderful production of a wonderful show. A show which for me is a really important part of my growing up as a lover of musical theatre. I remember going to see it at the Phoenix Theatre in its original London production, On My Own. And I think it was the same year I went off to see the 100th anniversary version of Gilbert and Sullivan's Ruddigore at the Sadler's Wells Theatre, also on my own. And bearing in mind that I was a naive green teenager at that time, that seemed like a big deal. Well, I'm an incredibly aged old husk now, but seeing any version of Into the Woods, as long as it's a halfway decent one, as this certainly is always a joy. And so today, I thought I would dig out of the archives a recording I made at the time that I saw the open-air theatre version of Into the Woods in 2010, that I conducted with an old friend of Musical Talk who we don't hear nearly enough of, noted theatrical producer Dominic Lindsay Beaton, who is a fine gentleman and very interesting to talk to, as you'll hear. Now, 2010 may stay in your memory in terms of Stephen Sondheim because it was a year that everybody but everybody was celebrating his 80th birthday. Well, he's since topped that in that way that he so often does by now becoming 90. And indeed, I believe he's actually now 91 as I record this. But in 2010, Stephen Sondheim was everywhere. And this London production of Into the Woods was part of an enormous worldwide celebration of his work, art and craft. And as you'll hear in the conversation I have with Dom, there'll be several references to Stephen Sondheim being 80 years old. So why not now wind your memory back, if you can, 11 years to 2010, to the London production of Into the Woods by Stephen Sondheim at the Regents Park Open Air Theatre. And if you can't do that, then watch the show in its virtual streaming production on Broadway HD and enjoy this conversation with the always excellent Dom Lindsay Beaton. Musical Talk. Everybody knows that there's one particular composer who this year has been 80. He's been 80 every day of the year.
365 days, in fact, in that year.
Which now, if you make that a cumulative 80 every day, makes him an incredibly old composer. But it is, of course, Stephen Sondheim. And there have been an array of shows and revivals and productions of his material across London. And Dom, you and I went to see Into the Woods at the Open Air Theatre, did we not?
We did, which ran, I think, from the 6th of August till the 11th of September, which closed the Open Air Theatre in Regents Park. It closed their season. For those listeners, for those international listeners, we have the Open Air Theatre just runs for the summer.
Yeah.
Because obviously we get a lot of rain in this country.
Usually in the summer.
Yeah. And they do have, the Open Air Theatre do have very strict policies about if it rains a bit, the show must go on, and audiences are expected to stay there, and people bring their raincoats, their umbrellas, and everything.
As indeed we did.
As we did.
But we didn't need it. We were lucky.
No, we didn't. We've actually. It's been quite a good few weeks for that. Into the Woods was on, because before that I think they had Macbeth, which got rained out a few times. They didn't cancel, but there was rain.
It was called Into the Floods.
Into the Floods. Into the Woods, Into the Hoods, Into the Floods. It's a concept that just keeps on giving. It's playing with fairy tales and nursery rhymes and things. But Into the Woods, it was a very successful show, I think, both artistically and financially. And it's been hailed even across the pond as a great revival of this production.
Well, it is a new production. It's not. It's by no means a warmed up. It's not Oliver. It's not. It's not the old show again.
No.
This is a new version. So let's talk about it successfully and as a piece. Mm-hmm. The Open Air Theatre gives it something which no other production can have, which is the fact that, and stop me if I'm going too fast, it's in the open air.
It's in the open air, and it's in the woods as well. So
there are trees actually at the back of the stage area which have been incorporated into part of the set here. So that concept of actually observing people living in a village in the woods, how did that work for you?
I think it worked incredibly well. I think commercially, the worry with Stephen Sondheim, as good as he is and as much of a following as he has, is sometimes his shows just don't make the Andrew Lloyd Webber killing at the box office.
Very rarely.
Very rarely. And Into the Woods, I would argue, is possibly one of his most well-known because of the concept. Like Sweeney Todd, it's his spin on someone else's story. And I think what was really good about this production was they made it commercial in its aesthetic. That by having the show Into the Woods in the woods, and it's a strictly limited run. The open air theatre it's got 1,000-seater or so.
It's just over.
It's we're looking at a Greek style amphitheatre, but you had these fantastic trees which. At one moment in the second act, when Mrs. Giant comes into it, I was so glad that she came in through the trees, because that's what I was hoping for. Yes. I was really hoping they'd incorporate that. And I think,
in some senses, you're almost above some of the shrubbery, which is what would happen if you were meeting a giant.
Absolutely.
I have to say I'm imagining here rather than speaking from the experience.
Well, when I met the BFG a long time ago, no, but I think that really plays into the concept of the show, and design-wise made it aesthetically. That's what made it commercial. Putting that on stage in a traditional cross-arch theatre in the West End, it's going to be fake. It's going to be a set design that will be fake. Whereas this was the houses, or rather the scaffolding that played to 3 levels, looked like it was wood, or it was entwined with vines and ivy and things, and it just played into the earthy nature of this piece. Organic, thank you, that's exactly the word.
Because The Witch is a fine example of that. In fact, when she's in her sort of decrepit Act 1 stage, she uses crutches. But she's almost grown into them. It's almost as though that they are branches on her tree.
Yeah.
And she's falling to bits, and nothing says. I have to say this: nothing says organic more than small imperfections, or in her case, or large physical imperfections. She was wearing she wasn't a bald wig, but she had thinning hair, and it was obviously thinning and patchy. Yeah. This is Hannah Waddingham, of course, who doesn't have that in real life.
And in the second act, certainly didn't have it.
She glams up rather.
Yeah.
Although, in a strange way, becomes less organic. I mean, the society if you're looking at society as an organic thing, then the end of Act 1, everyone gets their wish, or a lot of people get their wish, but the society falls apart very quickly. So, it's actually the cohesion that you imagine goes with an organic situation is in fact actually diminished. It's all sheen.
It does, and I think if we talk about the show's the concept of the show, not just the production at the open air theatre, a through thread which I've only recently noticed, which I wouldn't say is the centrifugal point of the show, but is the socialites. You talk about society, but actually the socialite of this hierarchy, the two sisters of Cinderella who want to be socialites. Arguably they are. The design for the open air theatre, their costumes definitely made them seem more the upper crust than Cinderella.
And they end up living in a palace with Cinderella, even though they've treated her very badly.
Absolutely, as does the mother. The witch, when she turns into, effectively, what looks like a sort of, I think, a 1940s, 1950s Hollywood starlet. The
20s bob sort of
thing.
The
20s bob, this golden
it's certainly
gown.
From the age of glamour, that's what.
Yes, from the age of glamour. And I think, with the exception of the baker and his wife and a few other characters, the majority actually want to climb this social ladder, which fairy tales often play with. I think that's one of the clever things that Stephen does in the second act. But I'm not sure if it always hits its mark. Certainly in the production we saw, it was acceptable, yes, but it wasn't as strong as the first act. And because once you get what you wish for, where else is there to go?
Well, I think this has always been the problem with Into the Woods. Act 1 is a masterpiece and could stand alone and is desperate to be turned into a pantomime, I think. But the second act is more. It's as you say, where do you go once you've got everything? And the second act, I think, falls apart a bit. It's not to say it's anything bad, but it is it's much weaker than the first act. And I think we have to be careful here, because we've been talking about Stephen Sondheim as the author of all of it, but of course James Lapine wrote the book.
Of course, yes.
And actually, so all praise and also all criticism, I don't mean that rudely, it goes to him. The Act 1 is a masterpiece. It's a beautiful structuring. And the conceit of building a new fairy tale, which is the baker and his wife, into the context of all other fairy tales, which was actually elaborated on in the production as well, because we had 3 of the extras dressed as pigs for no obvious narrative reason, but but like everything, the witch is the witch in various stories. The big bad wolf is obviously the big bad wolf of various other stories. So though we never actually get to know what's going on with the pigs, they do come wandering on holding straw,
and they don't say anything. They just come on with 3 little pigs, and then they walk off.
Yes, it's a kind of visual joke. But it makes everything. It's a cohesive fairyland again.
They are creating that world, which. To go back to your original question, I think it worked really well in the forest, in the wood, in this open air theatre. I think that works a treat for making this tricky concept commercial, because arguably, so many people, when you say about the concept, it's Into the Woods, it's merging of fairy tales, they think it's a family show. Whereas, on the website, it says this is not recommended for children below the age of, I think, 14, or when it was on below the
unless
age of 14.
They're appearing as the narrator. Which I think we ought to talk about, because this production did something very interesting, and I have a view on it, but tell me what your take on it was.
Well, the narrator in this production was a young boy.
10, would you say? Something like that?
10 or around that. Certainly not teenager. I really quite liked it. I think it suited well, for the most part, in putting the show into context of the idea of this boy is creating this fairy tale world. He's giving it life, and then it kind of runs away with itself.
And that happens because there's a tiny little extra prologue where he runs into a completely empty stage, which is the woods, on his own, with a bag, which you think is, and a sleeping bag and things like that. And then there's a sound effect, which is basically a family arguing. So he's run away from a family disturbance.
Yes.
And he gets out his bag, and I think you actually think it's going to be full of food or something like that, but of course it's full of toys. And as you say, what he then starts to do is he starts telling the story, and that is how we launch into the story. And so he's holding the toys, and the witch is a little troll doll and things like that. They're just the kind of toys any child would have, but he's turning them into the characters.
And we're seeing
then they arrive.
And then they arrive, and we're seeing his imagination Into the Woods. And then, again, in the second act, it kind of takes a strange turn for the boy, because he kind of becomes involved in his own story and becomes the victim of it, but then he can't be because he's telling the story. So that's quite strange.
Yes. That's always been the weakest point as far as I'm concerned. I don't like the destruction of the narrator in the second act.
But
it feels cheap, actually.
It seems it's being clever. It's sort of trying to, because the second act. I tell you what, if we tie this back to what you said originally about the first act being stronger than the second. Now, firstly, that's up against something which is quite traditional in sort of 20th, 21st century theatre, whereby you assume the second act is stronger than the first.
Yes.
Because
it builds to a climax.
Exactly. Yeah. The first sets us up, introduces us, gives us the point of the first point of drama. The second act explodes it all. So we sort of, that's what we're left with. So that's something that it's facing anyway, that assumption before you go to the theatre. A 21st century audience goes to the theatre. But the second trick within this musical of tricks is it's turning all these fairy tales on their head. It plays with our knowledge of what these fairy tales are, because the Brothers Grimm stories are terrifying,
and they are much more grim than they are Hans Andersen.
Absolutely.
Heels are cut off in the heels and toes are removed to try and make Cinderella's slipper fit.
And one thing which is why they've stood the test of time as fairy tales is because children like that gruesomeness. The best family shows and children's shows have an element of that to them.
Doctor Who.
There you go. And we had We're faced with a musical that is going to turn these characters that we know on their head a little bit, merge them all into one world, so we have this one fairy tale world, and be gruesome. And that's thoroughly enjoyable. And at the end of the first act, we see how they've all wound up to the places that we know it's left off at. And so it makes sense.
It's the happy ever after.
It's the happy ever after. So that makes sense to us because we kind of know what dramas will happen, where the stories will go, and it plays with our assumptions of what will happen. So in the second act, perhaps, to claim some of that back, to kind of turn it on its head, they do the unexpected and they get rid of the narrator, or they attack the narrator with his own story.
It is all about. I mean, there are several ways of interpreting that, aren't there? First of all, it shows the lie of the concept of happy ever after, because the first thing that Act 2 shows you is that they're not happy.
No.
So achieving their wishes hasn't done that. Then, as you quite rightly say, the loss of the narrator means, in fact, it's actually about taking responsibility and forging our own future, and actually forming a community in order to be able to do that effectively is the concept that's being developed there, and it is, without external influences. It's one fends for oneself, but one doesn't fend for oneself selfishly. Which is a hard lesson. Which actually, can I then take us on to what is the moral of Into the Woods?
What is the
because
moral?
I think it's extremely morally ambivalent.
But Into the Woods, I'd say don't go.
Well, I tell you why. Because Dame Judi Dench plays in a pre-recorded version plays the Lady Giant.
And of course, one of the reasons is because she's a huge fan of Stephen Sondheim and has worked in other of his productions. And it was, I think, along this year has been part of the 80th birthday celebrations at the Royal Albert Hall, at the Open Air Theatre, and along the way. So it was delightfully inevitable that she was going to turn up in this show.
She was going to collide with the Sondheim Jamboree.
Yeah.
Well, but the thing is, she is a very good actress. And in previous productions, and I was lucky enough to see the London production with Julia Mackenzie as the witch in 1990 at the Phoenix, before the interminable Blood Brothers turned up. And it was a marvellous show, and to this day I still think it's possibly the best production of Into the Woods I've seen. I've seen a few now, but that's not in any way to denigrate this, but for me that was still startling. I was also 19 or 20 at the time, which is probably about exactly the right time to be wowed by Sondheim at his height. So it was a love match, you understand. But in that original production, it has to be said that the fate of the giantess was more or less ignored, whereas Dame Judi portrays the giantess with genuine emotions. She's down on earth having a good old stamp around because someone's killed her husband.
Yes.
Perfectly reasonable thing to be angry about, in my view. And indeed, she's actually upset. You can hear her almost with a tear in her voice. And, of course, that doesn't stir any of the people on the earth, on the ground below. They still bump her off, essentially. And it's, hurrah, we've killed a living sentient being. Yeah. Isn't that jolly, everyone? It's a happy ending.
Which is one of the I think for this the production that we saw at the open air, I think they did emphasise that in the second act. There was a lot more emphasis than you get from, say, just listening to the music, just listening to the recording, or another show perhaps that other people have seen. But in this one, in the second act, it was about facing up to the consequences of their actions. Because let's face it, they slaughtered a wolf who was doing what nature
Wolves
intended, eating meat, and they slaughtered him quite violently. They slay the giant after they've invaded the giant's territory and taken his property.
Yes.
This idea that these things are different from them, so we have a right to kill them, is possibly the root of all prejudices.
Well, it's fascism, actually. It's fascism in action. So,
so
I don't think we established Jack and his mother's surname, but it might be Hitler. Jack Hitler, the lovable,
the lovable rogue,
and his cow, Milky White.
Milky White, and
or Aryan, as he's also known.
I think we've
cracked it.
We have cracked the moral ambivalence of the show.
But you talk about people taking responsibility for their actions. I'm not sure I entirely agree. With the Chamberlain, the prince's steward, if you like, bumps off Jack's mother for the greater good, and it's said that he will be made to pay for his.
Yes, that's sorry. So I
whilst
wasn't.
Jack is about to kill a giantess.
Yes, and my point was that rather not that they all are responsible. They all do face the consequences, but the point is made that they should do.
Oh well, I suppose.
And I think that's where the ambivalence lies, because arguably they get what they want, and in order to get what they want, they've done some pretty horrible things to each
and just
other.
A little bent, I believe.
To strangers as well as people they've
never met, and people they do
and
know.
People they know, and family members. Horrible things. And so in the second act, there's quite a lot of bloodshed.
Yeah. Barely a family is left untouched.
Absolutely. I think we're left at the end with possibly 3 characters still standing, which is arguably the comeuppance. Is they didn't learn their lessons, so they get crushed. And the baker, what's interesting with him is, I actually thought he was one of the most fully formed characters in this production, because normally I'm rooting for the wife and actually for the witch, and some of the other characters I find far more interesting.
It's actually quite a very interesting feminist piece.
It's very interesting feminist piece. And this time when I was watching it, I actually thought that's a cracking character, because he's formed in a 3-dimensional way whereby he wants to do the right thing as a husband, by providing for his wife who wants to have a child. And he, like many fathers who aren't fathers yet, isn't sure if he's up to the task. And furthermore, he wants to protect his wife, so he keeps telling her to please stay at home.
Yes.
Please just stay at home. And she's fully capable of helping out, which she does, and then more drama happens, they lose things, they get them back. And they're clearly in love, but he's clearly conflicted as to what choices to make. And then by the end, his punishment for possibly that indecision, and also robbing people of their property and lying, his punishment is he loses the thing that he's trying to protect the most.
Yeah. He gets a son but loses a wife.
Absolutely. And I think that's quite a big consequence that was emphasised more, I think, in this production than I've seen, or rather heard, in any of the various cast recordings. I
think, therefore, we ought to just pay tribute then to Mark Goldthorpe. Mark Goldthorpe, who was the understudy and stepped into the role of the baker
himself.
The baker himself, and as you say, played it beautifully, slightly understatedly. He's a kind of sort of. When I say a little man, I mean, I don't just mean short. I mean, he's not expected to go off and do battle in the woods.
He's a low status character.
Yeah. And he's a little bit world weary, and not in a kind of sort of nonchalant sort of, Noel Coward kind of.
No, but rather,
but as in kind of, life is a bit of a trial, and.
If we
liked it.
Yes, and if we talk about, again, the socialites and the hierarchy of the show, he is certainly not that. He's very humble when he meets the princess, or Princess Cinderella, I suppose we should say, in the second act. He's not a high status character in the least.
No, and nor is he trying to be either.
No, he's just trying to make his own way and give his wife what she's after. And I think that's why it was almost like the actor, he could sing. He sang beautifully, yes, but it was almost like a play.
Oh, yes.
You know, his delivery of lines and things, it wasn't...
it was an acting performance first.
Absolutely,
yes.
absolutely. And I think that's why it conveyed so much by the end. It's really a torturous environment that he lost quite a big... He lost the main focus of his life for the majority of the show at the end to learn his lesson. So I think there is, to go back to what you said originally, what is the moral stake in the show, if there is any message whatsoever, aside from, you know, don't go into
move
the
to the city.
Move to the city. Don't kill giants. You
Yes.
know those. But you know, I think that the classic, be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you wish for. If we take it that your fondest desires should always be perpetually absent from you, because once you get it, you will always want something else. You'll always want the next thing, and actually that's I think part of what makes us human.
Acquisitiveness
Is
which was covered in Dick Tracy, by the way, with the song "More," which is precisely that.
That something should be that it should
you always want more.
You always want more. No matter what you get, you'll always want more. It falls into our we are sentient beings. We are able to understand our world. You know, whether or not we understand someone else's is irrelevant in that context, because we want something and we have to get it. But if we do get it, we'll then want something even more extravagant, even greater, and even more unlikely. So what tends to happen is people create fantasies, and these fantasies will always be perpetually absent because they are fantasies. So in Into the Woods, we have a child's fantasy. We have this young boy creating these characters, as we say, you know, playing with his toys, and they come to life. But all the characters have these desires, which are, by today's standards, I would say ludicrous, but still achievable. So if we look at Cinderella, I mean, in the traditional context, she wants to go to the ball and become a princess. But she's a maid. What are the chances that could happen? When that happens, Jude Law ends up in the papers.
Yes.
So, and we're faced with that throughout the show. And so by the end of it, I think the result is be careful what you wish for, because we will always be greedy for more. And the repercussions will be devastating eventually, because we'll be greedy for so much. We'll be greedy for a goose that lays golden eggs, golden coins, and a harp who is incredibly attractive in this show at the Open Air Theatre.
Well, she puts it about. I mean, it's yes. I mean, she she doesn't have much to say, but she certainly looks as though she's giving Jack more than just a few songs.
Absolutely.
Doesn't she end up wearing sort of gold lame hot pants?
She comes on gold. I think that's exactly what she was. Gold lame hot pants, these gold killer high heels, and her hair was done to make the shape of a harp.
Yes,
which was quite something. And in fact, Jack ran on with her.
Yes,
and I think there's about 10 seconds of laughter and silence, because we knew exactly what the deal was. Why exactly he wanted to kill the giant and get the harp. But that's exactly, that's so fantastical, and the repercussions are he loses his mother.
Here's a question. We've touched upon the feminist nature of the piece. Actually, let's look at the significant characters are the baker's wife, Cinderella, and the witch. They are by far the three biggest. There's also Little Red Riding Hood, who's one of the survivors, so she makes it to the end. And yet, the last people we see on the stage, at the end of this production at least, is the baker and the narrator, i.e. two chaps. I'm not saying there's anything significant in that per se, but in this production, because like I think we may have mentioned before, this is the first time the narrator's been a child for quite some time, and what's alluded to is that the baker is actually a father of this boy who's found his son in the woods and is. This is in the coda, isn't it? Where the actor playing the baker is not playing the baker when he comes on as the father, but
or arguably it's not explicit. So
he's holding an electric torch, which is why I think it's a different time. But I accept the point. The fact they've used the same actor, you're supposed to draw that resonance.
Yes. Do we say he is the baker's son, older now, and the baker's son is trying to understand where his mother has gone in the context of Into the Woods, or is it just a father who's found a son who ran away?
Well, there are two issues here. The flip one is, of course, they start off in a medieval feudal society, and yet they've developed the electric torch within the boy is 10, and if he's the baby in the story, so that's within 10 years they've leapt from feudalism. That's Cinderella. She's a real progressive. But so it's why I don't take it. But I think I just ought to make the story of James Lapine here when he was workshopping this years ago in the mid '80s with Stephen Sondheim. One of the early drafts was precisely that revelation that in this case the man playing the narrator is revealed at the end of Act 2 as being the baby in the process in the play, and of course that's a beautiful tie-up. But for some reason they never went with that. And so this ending is a clever way of keeping the book as it was originally written in '87 with the kind of ideas which everyone you ever mentioned it to goes, oh, that's marvellous. So they've actually somehow weave the two concepts together. I don't know whether with Sondheim and James Lapine's agreement or whether it's just a directorial decision. But I think it works really well because you can have it both ways, which why we're having this discussion at all. The very fact that are they or are they not the same characters you've been watching? Yes.
I don't think the boy is the baby, as it were. I think it's just a story in his mind that he's trying to sift through in order to understand this argument that he's heard at home or whatever, and he's run away. But that's not to say that I could be wrong. You know, another audience member could absolutely prove me wrong and convince me of it another day. But I'd say we're talking about the fundamental, the important fundamental characters, and we touched on Mrs. Baker, the baker's wife.
She's not really named, is she? She is just Mrs. Baker.
She's Mrs. Baker.
Jenna Russell in the production we saw,
and she was fantastic.
She was, and she was a petite bundle of energy.
She was great. But what I would argue, the character again, to go back, be careful what you wish for. She's trying to keep her family together and get what she wants, and she's clearly smitten or overawed by the socialite world and the princes. Yeah. And in the second act,
she gets her royal end away, or rather she helps Prince Charming.
Exactly, she's seduced by the prince and gives in to him because she's effectively just had another argument with the baker and is just seduced by this man who's very charming, and they have a rip-roaring good time, I assume, in the woods, and then he goes off and leaves her by her lonesome. And that's something that she really should have done, considering just how much her husband's breaking his back to give her what she wants. Now, her husband, as we discussed, is already at fault and already has his own flaws. But this is the first time that possibly we could say that she's sunk to the depths that the other characters have sunk to in the show.
Well, it's infidelity, isn't it?
Exactly, which is something that not to be laughed at, especially in the fairy tale world.
Yes, promiscuity is very rarely favoured in, very rarely mentioned, for goodness sake. But yes, I mean, within the context of a fairy world, that is not going to be considered acceptable morals.
No, and if we talk about it so that's what happens. So if we talk about it as a feminist piece, what's that moment saying to us? Because she's a very strong character, but also a very wise character. You know, she is part of her world that there is this hierarchy. She's aware of the prince comes by and she bows her head and tries to help, but also she helps out Cinderella along the way. Granted, to try and get a shoe, but still helps her out. And so what point are they making by this very strong character giving into this?
But it's established all the way through that she's slightly morally ambiguous, because it's it's at the beginning in Act 1, the baker says, how are we going to get this child through deception? And she's singing, it's entirely right to be slightly bent. She actually says it, it's just a little bent, as I've said before. She is prepared to bend the rules from the beginning. She's a strong woman, but she's grey around the edges. So she's not a... This is a dreadful thing to say. She's because on the face of it, she is a good woman, but she's prepared. I suppose she represents most people in society in that she'll abide by the rules until such time as those rules get in the way of what she wants, which is the acquisitive thing that we've been discussing thematically as well. Yes, so I think she's a very grey character, more so than the witch, actually, who I think is entirely consistent. But we'll get onto that, I'm sure, in a minute.
So if we look at, as you're saying, the Mrs. Baker being a grey character, and I think that's a great way to put it, because very complex. I think that, the baker and Mrs. Baker kind of are two really good driving forces of the whole story, of everyone's story, and we put it.
So I've just suddenly remembered an old Kenneth Williams joke. Okay. The whole piece is great art, but of course she's a great art.
Yes, she is a great art.
Musical talk. We were talking about the grey lady and the consistency.
And the consistency of the witch, whereby the witch, you kind of know what she wants, and she wants to keep Rapunzel.
Yes.
And so when she loses Rapunzel, through her own desires, she loses Rapunzel to another man, and then to eventually death.
Yes.
So there is consistency in her selfishness from the start. Arguably Mrs. Baker is also selfish from the start, but I don't. Gosh, yes. Actually, are the parallels more? Are there more and more parallels? Yes.
I mean, the witch is interesting because I think of the witch as a stern mother, because it's absolutely true that she does love Rapunzel, and she's actually. I don't think Hannah Waddingham, with no disrespect to her, brought this out quite enough in the second act. But she's actually a broken woman because she has lost Rapunzel. She's got all her looks back. But is the loss of her daughter in speech marks.
Exactly. Be careful what you wish for once again. Absolutely. In the fairy tale. But I think you told me this when we saw the show. There was a song that was in this production that's not always, or hasn't always been in...
Oh, well, it was very briefly talking about the score changes, yes. There's the song that was written for the London production in 1990, which wasn't in the original Broadway version, which is called Our Little World, which is now incorporated as a genuine, as a standard part of the score. And then there were a couple of other changes to the score. Right at the end, in Children Will Listen, they've added a middle eight, which I think was actually written for Barbara Streisand to record on one of her albums, and I think actually takes the focus away. It makes the song. It was written to make the song a generic singable song for an album, but by sticking it in the show, you actually cause diminution of the point.
Yeah, you exactly. Yeah. No, you detract from the finale.
The specific becomes the generic in a rather clumsy way, I think. Particularly at the very end, when everything has been so filigree and clever and small and detailed, and then intimate and chamber piecey almost, and then suddenly you get this. I'm going to be rude. Barbara Streisand nonsense stuck at the end.
But to round it up.
That's right.
Just to put the bow on the music, as it were, because there's not quite a bow on the show. They don't give us that.
And then there was another song, and I can't remember which one it was now, where Little Red Riding Hood and Jack come on and sing the last, sing their own extra bits at the end.
Yes.
Just in a way, almost to remind people they're there. They've been off stage for a little bit. Jack presumably with the harp.
Well, which is an interesting their presence. I know we're still discussing the feminism here, but the presence of Little Red Riding Hood and Jack is I think that in this production, more so than perhaps the traditional fairy tales, the loss of innocence is driven home to a point whereby I think maybe that's one of the reasons why they survive at the end.
They're no longer naive.
They're no longer naive. They know exactly what they have to do because they both slaughtered wolves. They've killed giants. Putting a pickaxe in this head of a giant is no small feat for a child, let alone... for a man, let alone a child.
I don't want to do it.
No. Well, I'd rather hope we could make friends with these giants. But is that one of the moral questions that they're throwing up in this production by the end, that this loss of innocence is actually fundamental to surviving in a difficult and disastrous world. If you are innocent, you won't survive.
Who are the realists? The loss of innocence is also the development of realism. And that ties in very interesting to me, because I think Cinderella is the most realistically minded character, because she starts off very low. So she's had bad life. Her life has got progressively worse since her father married the stepmother. So, she's more or less, as you say, a maid in her own house. She has these ambitions, but she has a very strong philosophical drive all the way through. She's good to her mother and her mother's grave. She doesn't know how to play the situation with the prince at the ball, so she sits down and actually works it through, even though her decision is not to make a decision. There's also just that, she understands what's going on with the prince. Once it's, she doesn't show ever great emotions except sadness when her mother's grave is trashed by a giant. And then at the very end, she's got huge practicality, because actually when they all get together at the end, or the few that still do, to destroy the giantess, it's actually mostly her plan. Yeah. She says, let's get the birds to peck out her eyes. And then they say, we're going to stop her moving around. Let's spread pitch on the stairs. I've already done that. Yeah. So they're all going, what do we do now? And she's going, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this, and we could do that. And it's very clear at the end that she's going to be the driving force of rebuilding the society. She'll use people like the baker and Jack, presumably just because they're going to need people to do some breeding. But but she's clearly a sensible, understanding. And although she's got a wish, and she gets it, she doesn't let it go to her head. She doesn't retain it at all costs. And actually, she probably loses least in the process. She gets something, but she loses what she gets. But she's still better off at the end than she was.
And I suppose it's because she's the Cinderella, the pragmatic princess. If you have it in the context of Into the Woods, because her wish, if we look at it word for word, her wish is simply to go to the ball.
Yes.
Her wish is not to meet the prince. Yeah. And so that's why she runs away from him for quite some time, because she doesn't know if she likes him or not. So from the start, we have someone who wants a wish like everyone else, and when she gets it, the consequences are this prince loves her. Now, she's pragmatic. She has a life that she's not particularly fond of. This is a better option. This is a much better option. I don't think, by today's standards, I don't think anyone would say that's a bad choice.
But is it a love match?
I don't know. It's not a love match.
As you say, it's a status improvement, which takes us back to where we started.
Yes, and I think if we look at the agony in the second act, that tells you exactly what the princes are about, whereby they're doomed to repeat the way that they were written. Yeah. It's not their fault, really.
They chase princesses or damsels because they cannot do any other.
Because that's exactly how they're written, and I think that's why it's such a tragically humorous part, because they're stuck in it. They're stuck. They have to fulfil their role in the fairy tale.
Well, actually, the prince is both princes are two of the characters who actually change very little. Their journey is very slight. They have incidental things happening to them. Like they do marry their first choice, and then they both lose their first choice. And then they go off and start chasing their second choice. But they aren't really caught up vastly in the, they're quite unperturbed by the fact there's a giant stalking the land, because actually they bump into the prince and he says, I'm off hunting giants, but he's clearly not. And he doesn't care.
No, he's not walking the other way.
Yeah, but he's also not worried for his own health or safety, because he's just carrying on with what he does. Yeah. In a way, he's almost... I suppose he represents lack of community, because he's in everything for himself, but not in a truly evil way. He's just
I think
amoral, I suppose.
Amoral, sort of ambivalent, because he's been thrust into a situation that he actually has no desire to be in, and actually doesn't have a grasp on it either. I think what is interesting about the agony in the second act is that's the moment when you realise they know what they are, and that realisation is torturous for them, but they can't change it, so they carry on. Whereas the other characters, that when they realise what they are and what they could become, they make the effort to change it. They get rid of Milky White to get the beans to go up the.
There's a song in that.
Milky White. But that's what they can change it. Whereas they are doomed to repeat their fate, and they're aware of that. And I think that's. I did quite like it in the context of... I did quite like it. I did quite like it in the second act, because it would have, I think, muddied the waters of an already complex web that the second act is, which is, as we've said, is tricky to navigate, and that's why it doesn't quite work as well as the first act. So if you then introduce the princes suddenly to become kings and to take charge,
or the other way round, they renounce their royalty and become sort of citizens,
or exactly,
it also wouldn't work.
It wouldn't work, because it comes out of left field, to use the American phrase. It comes out of nowhere, and it would, I think, go against what we're saying about these strong female characters. Actually, Cinderella taking charge, Princess Cinderella.
I think that's very interesting. I'm not sure we've got much more we can push on that one.
No, I don't think so.
So overall then, in your view, quickly, what was good about the production that we saw, and what is good about the show?
About the show, that's a good question. I think nationally in England, into the
or
woods.
Britain.
Or Britain, yeah.
Let's define out. Let's start a good definitional point here.
Yeah. I'm just going to say, the show itself, the production received, and I think rightfully so, high praise from audience members and the press. I think it got 4 stars across the board from pretty much everyone. Every national press we have, it got 4 stars across the board. The Times, the Guardian, the Independent, the Daily Mail. And it was a very good production. My concerns with the production were actually in some of the directing, because we were sat on, I would say, the left bank, so stage right. Yeah. So stage right, the left bank. And, for example, when the giant comes through the forest, it's actually blocked behind quite a few trees, so I can kind of see it's there, so I can kind of get the effect. But the centre bank and the right-hand side bank were in hysterics, because obviously they get the full impact visually. And there were also a few blocking moments of characters running on, not even to say a line, but running on because they have to, and then running off again, that just looked a bit sloppy. And that's not to say that they have to cut out the entrance and the exit, but rather it was a tricky stage to navigate, and it wasn't quite perfected to me. I would say, always just bring the character on a little bit earlier from a different entrance. That makes it seem more natural.
So what we're saying is there isn't quite an integration between the blocking, the choreography, and the set design. Yes.
And the set design that they had, which I loved. I loved the set design that they had. I thought it was spectacular.
Lots of levels, yes.
And I did really like the costumes. I think the costumes and the directing on the whole was very good. But there were these elements of blocking where I did think to myself, has someone sat in the worst seats in the house to watch the show and said to Timothy Schroeder, who's the director, I couldn't see those bits. That's one thing, because there were just too frequently, there were moments when jokes were lost. There was a moment where Rapunzel, I assume, stumbled out drinking because the rest of the audience laughed.
But we couldn't see it, did we?
No one in our bank laughed because we couldn't see it at all. And so I think there were elements of that which pulled the show back, but not in a major way that I wouldn't have recommended it. And I did like the fact that it was big audiences. It was selling well, because I think the show deserved it.
My view on this production is that I enjoyed it immensely. I don't think it surpasses the 1990 London version I saw, and I'll tell you why. And it's going to play to all my particular prejudices, but actually it was played more as a drama than a comedy, I thought. Because you mentioned a couple of misfire jokes. I actually didn't think that the golden thread of comedy, because it's not a comedy by any means, but it's quite light-hearted in a lot
especially in the first act.
Yes,
as well.
And not just because of the baker's wife. In fairness, actually gets most of the laugh lines. But I think there was more incidental comedy in the past, and I think that felt toned down, and the drama for me felt toned up. And I enjoyed that, but for me, I do like an occasional spot of lightness. So it wasn't quite... you could argue that it shouldn't be a light production anyway. In fact, actually, we're taking us very back to the beginning about nature's lighting and the fact we're outside. The show, as it gets darker and darker, particularly in the second act, we were seeing it on a summer's night. It started off light, and just as night fell locally in London... it became very dark, and of course that's exactly what's happening to the characters. They're fighting for their lives in the second act, and I thought, oh Lord, I don't know who they've got on board to change the sky, but he did a marvellous job.
Which actually, I think just to touch slightly off of Stephen Sondheim for a moment, the open air theatre for the past 2 years, they've commissioned really great work where that happens. Earlier this year they had The Crucible, Arthur Miller's The Crucible, and the same concept applies, whereby as they get darker and darker into eventually the prison
and the scaffold,
night has fallen, and it's a dark place to live. Whereas at the start, it's morning, and it is bright. And I think that whoever's commissioned these shows has been very savvy with the commissioning. And Into the Woods is, as you say, is no exception to that rule.
I think Hello Dolly last year might have been, but I'm not going to push the point.
That was last year, Thos. That was, I think, episode 150 or something.
And overall, then, the final bit of that question was, what do you think of the piece?
Of the piece. Now, it is very good but problematic, I think, which is, and I'm saying this actually from a producer's standpoint, I think, and the problematic nature is, I love this production because the organic, as you said, the organic nature and the design went very well with the concept of Into the Woods. But I don't know how to sell it. I wouldn't know how... If Stephen Sondheim wasn't Stephen Sondheim...
Yes.
And in today's climate of getting new musicals on, which is no small feat. I mean, it's never been a small feat to get new musicals on, but it's so expensive now. If you said, I've got this great concept of turning these fairy tales upside down, it's quite dark. Oh, is it a children's story? No, it's not. It's actually for adults.
Quite specifically not a children's story.
But it's fairy tales, yes. Okay, and so at the end, do they all live happily ever after? Like, no, at the end of the first act, they live happily ever after, and at the end of the second act, they don't live at all. So, from a producing standpoint,
ever after.
The problematic nature would be who can take a risk on that. Because I know if it wasn't Stephen Sondheim, I wouldn't as a producer. I wouldn't.
That's a very interesting point. Yes.
And I'm not talking about the structure being problematic here, or like we've already spoken about, the second act kind of throwing up the difficulties because you're having to invent new fairy tales on these old fairy tales that we knew already, which is why the first act is so strong and so beautiful. Because we've discussed that element, but just as a piece, where does it fit? And that's what would concern me, and I think that's why it is tricky. I think that's why it was a good choice for the open air theatre, because it put a slant on it that made it relevant. But actually, would you put it in the West End again and have to? How would you do that without it being a Sondheim? It is a Sondheim, so that's kind of a moot point. But if it was a new musical, how would you market that?
Yes, the canon it falls into is the Sondheim canon, and in no other. And I think the point you make is so well made, but actually, he couldn't have written it earlier either. It's late middle period. It has to be, because it's very sophisticated. More so than Funny Thing Happened. More so actually than Anyone Can Whistle. But those are broader brush pieces. Yeah,
where he's gained his audience.
Yes.
So that he can say, "Oh, this is the new Sondheim. I have to go see that."
But where does a filigree musical fit in the West End anyway these days? By filigree, I mean sophisticated and,
Oh, come on. Grease is a phenomenal show. How could you talk that way about it?
Yes, and I did see Legally Blonde relatively recently as well. But, that's the fodder. I mean, they're good. They're very good. I'm not criticising them. But Ragtime didn't do very well, and that's a similar-ish piece. Even that's more broad brush than this, I think, though.
But then what you have is, I think, the way the market's answered that is theatres like the Open Air Theatre, the Many a Chocolate Factory, and the National, they have answered that question in the marketplace, because a commercial West End producer is not going to go, I know what I'm going to put on, what could we say, what would be a really tricky Sondheim to sell on the West End? So Into the Woods could arguably work, Sweeney Todd could arguably work, because they've got a bit of razzmatazz, a bit of big set pieces.
Pacific Overtures would be very
Pacific
good.
Overtures, okay, let's put on Pacific.
Do you know Pacific?
Yes, I do know Pacific Overtures. So, how could you sell that? It's a big gamble. Whereas companies that have subsidy and are known to reach a sort of educated theatre-going audience, the Many a Chocolate Factory being a good example, that can then create a transfer. I think that's where Sondheim's going. I mean, we have Passion currently playing at the Donmar. That's a really good example of where his work has to fit. And there's no stopping a Little Night Music.
Yeah.
That's commercially, it's reached a lot of people. It does have quite a few famous actors in it, in each version that's been done both in the West End and on Broadway, which helps, obviously.
And elsewhere, Leslie Caron is doing it in Paris.
Really? Wow, I didn't know that. Crikey. So, there you go. But that's what helps that particular production. But they're transfers from smaller subsidised houses that can take the financial risk.
And they're feeder houses as well.
Absolutely.
So, if it pays off, then the big boys gobble it up.
Absolutely.
Particularly if it comes from the Chocolate Factory, obviously.
Sonia Frieden Productions, I think they must see every show at the Chocolate Factory on the off chance that they can transfer.
Well, it's such a good cafe there.
So I think that's, as a show, that would be my concern. What's your opinion on that, Thos?
Well,
as a show,
As a show, I think it's... this is a good example of Sondheim in that it is a flawed piece, Act 2 in particular, but it is as close to a successful Sondheim as you're going to get. It has been said that it's the most accessible, simplistic on the face of it, and yet considerably not underneath. I tell you why I think it's the most successful. I'm just thinking, why is this better than Ragtime, which is obviously not by him? And I think the reason is that Ragtime tackles themes and politics, and this is about the human condition. And themes and politics go in and out of favour, whereas the human condition does not. Yes, it's all dressed up in the trappings of fairy tales, but actually it's about anyone can go and see this. And if they are human and have human emotions, so as long as they're not sociopaths, and I very rarely go to the theatre with sociopaths if I can help it. They never pay for the ice cream. I think you will get something out of it, whereas I think you could very easily go to Ragtime and say, I'm not actually interested in this period of history or these particular political drives, which is sad, but there you go.
But true.
Yes.
But true.
So am I going to say Sondheim's best piece? Oh, if I do, I'll get the emails. Right, I'm going to do it, and let's see what happens. I think this is Sondheim's best show. Let me put it this way: it's my second favourite Sondheim show, but I think it's more accessible than Merrily, which is the one I like best.
I think if it's your second favourite and most successful, that's pretty good. Kudos. So that's Thos at musicaltalk.co.uk.
Please be nice. Dom, thank you very much indeed for that very interesting conversation. We've discussed feminism and fascism and lots of other things that begin with F. But genuinely interesting forensic. There we are. There's another one.
No, and I think it was a very good production and it's a good show. And I'll be interested to see in Stephen Sondheim's 81st year what's put on in the West End and on Broadway.
Noel Coward. Musical talk. Well, there we are, a conversation from 2010 with Dom Lindsay Beaton. And he's someone I always enjoyed having conversations with, and I hope perhaps to have some more in the future, although he is a very busy man as a producer of theatre. And Lord knows, if there's a role that any of us need in the future, that's going to be one. Because theatre is going to struggle, I think, in the next year or so as we emerge from the coronavirus pandemic. And I hope that conversation has also whetted your appetite for seeing that 2010 production of Into the Woods. And as I said in my introduction to this episode, you can do so if you're British because it's available on Broadway HD. Go and have a look at that website. Which is not to say it's not available to people elsewhere, but I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. Except to say, why don't you go and have a look as well and see if it's there. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Musical Talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's brought back some memories. I hope it's encouraged you to go off and start looking at virtual theatre if you haven't already done so. As I've said before, it's not nearly the same or not nearly as good as sitting in an auditorium and actually watching theatre happen around you, with you, and of course being part of it, because that's what an audience is. It is part of the theatrical experience, and it's one of those things I've missed terribly in the last year. However, there is at least some glimmer of light as we move towards the summer, that there will be a return to some form of normality, certainly in the United Kingdom, and it's a wish that I have for every country in the world. But my talking about it won't make any difference, so I'm going to stop talking to allow you to go off and live your lives in the meantime. And do join us again here on Musical Talk next week and every week as we talk about every highway and byway of musical theatre, the most common shows to the most obscure. There's almost no show we won't cover. Cover it in what is a totally different question, although we do try to be positive. But the most positive thing I can say to you now is that word you're longing for me to say. So I won't keep you in suspense any longer. Here it is. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited by Thos and presented by Thos and Dom Lindsay Beaton. Copyright 2021. To find out more about the world of musical talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. This is a test, and it does seem to be working. Let's see if we can avoid being adenoidal. Adenoids me.